Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. South Korea slashed its growth outlook for this year to 1.4%, which is a 0.2 percentage point drop from the previous forecast. Yet the finance ministry says it expects better recovery for the latter half with improvements in inflation and the nation's employment rate being indicators. What are the details behind the finance ministry's expectation and what do experts forecast for the economy? For an in-depth analysis, we invite Professor Oh Joon-seok, Dean of Sookmyung Business School. Professor Oh, welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. And we also have Professor Shim Myung-kyu from Yonsei University. Professor Shim, good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, first question to our Professor O. Now, earlier this week, President Yoon said that the second half of 2023 will be an inflection point for the economy. In what ways is it an inflection point?
Yes, President Yoon said the second half of this year will be an inflection point. And the Prime Minister suggested the Korean economy will see a rebound second half of this year. Though uncertainties remain still, I suppose, yes, it could be a momentum of shift in two respects. First, global factors of economy tells us to set a plan for a change. China is the center of concern for Korea as #1 trade partner. And then it is considered China's slowdown would be a damage to Korea. But last year, trade volume with China tumbled down by 26%, and then we have experienced the China risk much more than enough during the COVID-19, risk of market and risk of supply chain disruption. Now, Korea needs to insulate China risk, I suppose, as China's potential should not be ignored. But Korea must pivot more aggressively toward India, Vietnam, as well as other ASEAN countries and the Middle East to extend its trade frontiers. And second, domestic factors also tells us it's right timing of industrial transition and applying different approaches. Inflation is falling from over 6% to the 2% range, and last month's turnaround from a trade deficit to a trade surplus. The transitional period calls for a structural reform to reassess and rebuild economic fundamentals. And President also called for removing killer regulation that deter the investment decision. In short, two things to count as inflection, as China shift, and system reformation. China risk should be insulated, and Korea plan to go all out for promoting export and investment to lead momentum for an economic recovery in the future.
Right, I see. So second half could indeed be a momentum for South Korean economy. Now, Professor Shim, the finance ministry lowered the overall 2023 economic growth rate outlook to 1.4%. And as we have already discussed, it pointed out that the pace of growth will double in the second half compared to the first 6 months. What is your view over this overall growth forecast and what would back this growth in the second half of this year?
Well, first of all, I think that the fact that the official forecast is even lower than those of our other institutions such as KDI, OECD, and the IMF implies that the economic environment has become even worse during this year, posing negative forecasts on the Korean economy for the coming next 6 months. If we exclude 2020, which is the exception due to the COVID-19 crisis, this figure is the lowest since the financial crisis. As the uncertainty on the future inflation rate has not been fully resolved, I do not expect that there would be active expansionary monetary policies across the world. Also, the current state of the government on the tax collection is not that positive. This further implies that the government cannot really impose active fiscal policies to spur the economic growth. If the world economy does not recover faster than we expect, so that export cannot increase that than we really expect, I expect that the negative view on the economic growth this year will not change that much.
Right, I see your point. Now, we are going to talk about significant economy-related indicators one by one, but let's first focus on exports since South Korea is an export-driven economy. Now, fortunately, the Finance Ministry reported a trade surplus in June for the first time in 16 months. Could we say, Professor Oh, that exports are on the way to making a recovery? I mean, do you see this trend continuing?
Just to hit the bottom, it could be an encouraging sign, but not yet. A lot of things to do more to continue this trend. I perfectly agree on Professor Shim. Tell you why. Simply speaking, more than 50% of imports to Korea consist of raw material, energy parts, or components. Think about for a moment. July and August are vacation season of the year. Could you guess? Manufacturing facilities would lower the inventory level of raw material, parts, and components by reducing imports. One of the major reasons that trade deficit has changed into surplus, but the market is not recovered. We have to pass the acid test in September and October. Of course, I do respect a lot of tough efforts for Korean companies and governments to boost up the trade, for pioneering new market and new trade item. Outstanding performance increased export to Europe and the Middle East. Export to EU rose 5.7% on a year in the first 6 months, and outbound shipment to the Middle East spiked up 14.3% to $9.79 billion US dollars. Cars and machines spearheaded the jump in this region. Car export by 56.9% up, and machines by 8.6% up. EV market in Europe and machinery in the Middle East, where the economy is relatively stable and oil prices are low, in addition to new trade items. Think about it, Korea will work on being one of the weapon sellers in the world. To invigorate the venture, Korean government will inject 141 billion US dollar in trade financing within this year. But still now, it is a time of investment, not the time of harvestment. So we have to wait to invigorate this kind of venture. Still, we have time to wait for the performance.
Right, I see. So there is still a long way to go in terms of export area. Now, Professor Shim, in order to promote exports, President Yoon underlined the importance of correcting rules and systems that go against the global trend. What is the President Yoon referring to? Could you give us some examples?
Well, my understanding on what President really implies by promoting exports through correcting rules and systems is that the Korean economy should boost up productivity through correcting or eliminating old rules or systems that lower creativity of the Korean economy. As we know, importance of creativity to achieve competitiveness at the world markets become more and more important. In this sense, I think the government intervention that directly affects the fund's activities, like the investment, might be the hurdle that prevent creative construction or destruction to occur in this economy. According to my understanding, there are so many rules that are set by the government, and such restrictions drag the creative activity of entrepreneurs. Maybe we can think of the new policies like imposing sandboxes for the new firms or new industries may be helpful to relieve this kind of concerns. And also, according to a recent study in macroeconomics, even a rule that is set to correct existing problems in the economy and hence is effective will create problems in the long run because the rule is not adopted by the changed environment. In addition, I think the traditional notion that the government lets the private activities still remain in the Korean economy, and maybe that is another rule or systems that the president referred to. So what I think is it was appropriate for the Korean economy to allow the government to intervene the market economy a lot when the Korean economy was at the early stage of growth. But the situation has changed so that I think what the government has to do is to minimize its intervention on the market so that we can really increase the creativity of the market economy.
Right, so the government needs to minimize its intervention in the business sectors. Now, one more thing, Professor Shim. He also mentioned how monopolistic structures that share in building cartel benefits must be strictly destroyed. What does cartels with benefits refer to, and what direction is the Yoon administration pursuing right now?
So I have the consistent idea with the answer to your previous question. I think the direction is to pursue the market-led economy because any cartels sharing benefit with each other will be hurdles to spur competitions, which is essential for achieving higher growth rates. For example, the recent collapse of an apartment complex construction site in Incheon can be the result of a cartel in the construction sector. Each level of firm wants to maximize its profit, and thus they make a cartel pursuing benefits and ignore safety of the citizens. Such cartel might be enhanced with the naive supervision of the government that also wants to provide more apartments promptly. Another example would be the case of chicken processing firms fixing prices between 2008 and 2017, which was fined by the government. What they exploited was the consumer surplus by making a cartel, and prohibiting such behaviors would benefit the Korean economy and might boost up the growth rate.
I see your point. Now, Professor Oh, meanwhile, the primary focus of South Korea for over the past few months has been inflation, and it slowed down to a 21-month low of 2.7% in June, showing a clear trend of easing inflationary pressure. Now, how do you see this figure, and compared to other countries, how are consumer prices in South Korea right now?
As you mentioned, the inflation rate fell below 3% for the first time in 21 months. According to Statistics Korea, consumer price index CPI stood 111.12 in June, up 2.7% from a year earlier. It marks the first time the rate fell to 2% range since September 2021 and continues the 5 months of slowdown in consumer price growth that began after posting 5.2% in January. This is also true to other major countries. EU inflation was 7.1% in May, down from 8.1% in April. And the United States is at 4 compared to 4.93% last month and 8% last year. It is a commonality. Inflationary pressure around the world comes down slowly. The decline is attributed mainly to drop in the energy prices, which plunged 25.4% in June from a year earlier, the largest fall since January 1985. Other things being equal, lowering inflation will be a good signal for the market expansion, recovering market volume, both domestic and global market, which is expected to boost some of Korea's key industries, especially semiconductors and the EV sectors. As to Fisher effect, is a kind of economic terminology, but as to Fisher effect, expecting the inflation is strongly related to interest rate changes. As the consumer price has been dropping since February this year, it means the BOK is expected to have more room to maneuver, at least the interest rate hike speed down, or no more interest rate hike after. In this respect, some are projecting the BOK will likely loosen the monetary policy. However, the Korean government have a conservative view on the overall economic growth projection.
Right. I mean, it is great to hear that inflationary pressure is slowly going down. But Professor Shim, though South Korea is showing signs of recovery based on major economic indicators, including inflation, authorities say there are still lingering uncertainties that could affect the economy. What are they, and how should they be tackled?
So I can think of three uncertainties surrounding Korean economy. First uncertainty is that the interest rate is still high because of the remaining concern for high inflation rate. Importantly, global warming, together with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, possibly affect the food prices, and hence the inflation rate in most of the economies might not decline that much this year. The worry over the inflation rate will make the central banks not to lower the rate quickly than market expects, which should result in lower consumption and investment. Second uncertainty that I thought was that there is a pressure on the production cost arises from the policies to lower the speed of global warming. New technologies to lower CO2 increases the cost of farms so that the inflation rate does not decrease that quickly. And the third uncertainty is a possible negative shock from the financial market because of the very prolonged high interest rate period. Financial crisis is known to harm the overall economy more than the usual recessions, as we have experienced after the Great Recession. Given that most of the factors that I mentioned are sort of out of control from the perspective of the government, my suggestion is that the policymakers should focus more on the plausible targets, such as stabilizing the financial market so that we can prevent the further financial crisis.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Oh, I'd like to also tap on the budget area. Usually, to stimulate the economy, a country increases its budget. However, South Korea's tax revenue reportedly fell by around $28 billion in the first 5 months of this year from a year earlier. Now, before we move on to talk about whether we need an extra budget or not, why has tax revenue fallen?
Jokingly say the name of Finance Minister of Korea matters. Chu Kyung-ho is a combination of extra budget with a preference. In this respect, journalists and politicians might think Finance Minister would turn on extra budget for economic recovery. At the moment, there are two policy options to boost urban economy: spending money by extra budget and cutting budget by saving money. As saving money is to deleting burden far from populism, so spending money is to delaying burden for populism. A finance minister of Korea has taken a saving budget rather than spending budget. And recently, he repeatedly and confirmed Korea was not considering planning a supplementary budget, despite a looming decline of $12 billion worth of tax revenue as of February from a year ago amid a slow economy. Now, as you commented, why fallen tax revenue? There are many reasons to tell, but what is certain is tax is levied when income is realized. As the economy went into recession due to COVID-19, Russian-Ukraine crisis, business opportunity has withered globally. It is natural dropping tax revenue comes from dropping business income. In addition, the government have to support necessary consumption of the lesser group by cutting fuel taxes, individual consumption taxes, and even real estate taxes. And the previous government dropped supplementary budget 10 times from 2017 to 2022. There is no free lunch in economy. Spending money should be redeemed in the next generation's burden, mainly due to increasing taxes. Of course, the government have to count in the factors of keeping the livelihood of the lesser group by supporting basic consumption. It might be considered for investors as a speculation when the Korean government could propose an extra budget to reinvigorate the economy and boost the saving demand. In this reason, that Korean government have to turn on the saving revenues.
Right, I see your point. Now, before we wrap up this segment, I'd like to also tap on the rate-setting meeting that is going to take place next week. So, Professor Shim, given the lower consumer price rises, many expect the key interest rate to be maintained at its current level. What do you see?
I also agree with the usual idea that the meeting will maintain the policy rate at the current rate. The inflation rate in June was 2.7%, which is already pointed out by Professor Oh, which is even lower by 0.6% point from that in May. While it is still higher than the target inflation rate of the BOK, which is 2%, the gap between the actual inflation rate and the target inflation rate is now lower than 1%, giving more rooms for the BOK to wait until the uncertainties surrounding the Korean economy can resolve. However, we should also notice that the core inflation rate has been lowered by less than 1% point from the peak, while the inflation rate measured by CPI has declined by more than 3% point from 2022. This implies that the decline of the inflation rate measured by CPI might be mainly driven by temporarily stabilized food and energy prices. With the uncertainty mentioned before, I think this fact implies that the BOK will take a cautious step to raise or lower the rate.
Right, I see. But one of the concerns that we have is, the widening gap, interest rate gap between the U.S. and South Korea. Do we also have to worry about this part, Professor Shim?
Yeah, so let me first share the fact that the current interest rate gap between Korea and the U.S. is 1.75 percentage point, which is at the historically highest level. So what I agree with the view of some experts that the BOK should closely look at what the Fed will do, as Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, signaled the markets about 10 days ago that the U.S. economy seems to be still strong, suggesting that the economy can endure more interest rate hike. The unemployment rate in May was 3.7% in the U.S., which is a positive sign for the economy because it's low, and it is accompanied by 4% inflation rate, which is the opposite sign for the economy. So this is a figure which is still twice the target inflation rate of the U.S. And thus potentially pushes the Fed to raise the policy rate. So the further hike in the interest rate of the U.S. without changing rate in Korea might widen the interest rate gap further, which can potentially stir capital outflow, which is not the problem at this point, but the situation may change if the gap becomes more larger.
Right, I see. We'll just have to wait and see what decision Bank of Korea makes. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Shim, and of course, thank you, Professor Oh, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend. Goodbye.